The scent hit Clara Muller before she even saw the camp. Rich coffee, sizzling bacon, eggs golden as sunlight. For 3 long years, her stomach had known only hunger, her dreams haunted by thin, gray bread and watery soup. Now, in the sweltering dawn of Mississippi, the aroma teased her senses like a memory from another life, a life that felt impossibly far away. She pressed her hands to the wire fence, heart pounding. Could paradise exist in a place called Camp Co? And if it could, would she dare to reach for it? Today, Clara and her fellow POWs would discover the taste of a world they had been taught to fear. April 28, 1945. Camp Co, Mississippi. Clara Muller, 23, pressed her gaunt face against the chain-link fence, eyes wide at the unexpected sight. American soldiers unloading crates with a calm efficiency she hadn't seen in years. Her companion, Annalise Becker, a former nurse from Hamburg, shivered with hunger and disbelief. For weeks, they had endured transport through war-torn France, living on watery soups and bread barely edible. Now, the southern sun-carried scents that seemed almost sinful, coffee dark and steaming, bacon crisping in fat, eggs frying golden on the griddle as the women stepped closer, cautious yet mesmerized. Reality collided with propaganda. Germany had taught them to fear Americans, to expect cruelty, starvation, and punishment. Yet here, in this foreign land, they were greeted not with hostility, but with abundance. Every tray placed before them was a revelation, a challenge to everything they had been told. The war was over. The enemy was human. And in that moment, Clara realized that survival could taste like paradise. If you're fascinated by untold stories of WWII, stay with us as we follow these German women through their first weeks in America's story of fear, discovery, and the quiet power of kindness. April 28, 1945. The Mississippi sun rose sluggishly over the sprawling Camp Co, painting the wooden barracks in a pale, unforgiving light. In the back of a rattling transport truck, Liesl Hartman pressed her cheek against the splintered wood, inhaling deeply. The air smelled different, warm, humid, and faintly sweet. A distant scent of frying bacon curled through the morning breeze, and for the first time in months, her stomach knotted not with hunger, but with disbelief. Beside her, Annika Weiss, a petite nurse from Dresden, clutched the edges of the truck bench, her hollow eyes reflecting exhaustion and skepticism. Is that real?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rumble of the engine. Liesl shook her head, unable to answer. It smelled impossible, like a memory of home, distorted by years of hunger. The truck jolted to a stop. The prisoners were herded through the gates, the chain link fences looming over them, glinting in the morning sun. The tall, stern figure of Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Simmons, a seasoned nurse in her 40s, stood at attention, clipboard in hand. Her gaze swept over the group of German women like a careful scientist, measuring every reaction. "Welcome," she said in careful English, and an interpreter repeated it. "You will be fed. You will be treated according to international law." The women shuffled forward, their wooden clogs scraping against concrete pots, a chorus of tiny, weary sounds. Liesl felt her knees tremble as she caught sight of the dining hall. A long serving line stretched ahead, trays stacked with what seemed like every imaginable breakfast, golden yolks glistening, bacon crisped to perfection, steaming coffee curling into the air. Her pulse raced. Years of deprivation, of rationed turnip soup and stale bread, of rumor and fear, all collided in a single moment. Annika's hand trembled as she clutched the wire mesh of the serving table. Tears pricked her eyes. I thought we'd be starved," she whispered. Liesl nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. The air was thick with disbelief. Around them, women stared silently at the trays, some hesitating, some moving with a cautious urgency as if fearing the food might vanish. "Please, take what you need," said a young private, barely older than a girl, her hands shaking slightly as she laid down slices of bacon and eggs on metal trays. Liesl's fingers brushed against the warm fork. She brought a piece of egg to her lips, hesitant, almost afraid the taste would shatter the illusion. Salt and fat mingled perfectly, the flavor rich and overwhelming. She gasped softly, the tears spilling freely now, unrestrained. This can't be real," whispered Margot Keller, a tall woman with sunken cheeks and wary brown eyes, who had spent the last year as a radio operator near the French front. "They lied about the Americans, about their cruelty. We were taught they would starve us, torture us." Her voice faltered, broken by disbelief. Liesl could only nod, her throat tight. The truth had arrived in the form of breakfast, real, abundant, and impossibly generous. Across the hall, older women like Hilda Braun, 48, moved slowly, taking each bite with careful precision. She had survived hunger during both world wars, and yet even she couldn't conceal a small, incredulous smile. She thought of her sons on the Eastern Front, of the rubble that awaited back home, and felt a strange pang guilt intertwined with relief. The camp was alive with subtle hums of activity, barracks being inspected, beds made, women quietly conversing, and guards monitoring with watchful eyes. Liesel's gaze wandered across the faces around her. Young, old, strong, fragile, they had all been molded by the war's cruelty. Yet here, for the first time, they were simply human beings again, offered a taste of kindness in a world that had taught them only hatred. After breakfast, the women were assigned their quarters, bunks with real mattresses, clean blankets, and sheets that smelled faintly of soap awaited them. Showers with hot water were available, and for many, the sensation of being clean again felt like a small miracle. Annika lingered under the cascading water, letting the heat wash away the grime of months, of fear, of survival instincts honed by hunger. Liesel joined her, breathing deeply, feeling the stiffness in her muscles loosen. By midday, a routine began to form, though the women were still stunned by the sheer normalcy around them. Laundry, cleaning, quiet chatter in the mess hall, all of it reinforced a single, staggering truth. Their enemies were feeding them, caring for them, treating them as people rather than prisoners of war. And in that realization, a quiet rebellion began to bloom in each heart. Liesel and Annika sat side by side that evening, small trays in front of them, untouched but tantalizing. Tomorrow, Annika whispered, I'll taste it, everything. Liesel nodded, staring at the chocolate square tucked into her tray. Tomorrow, they would taste the world again and perhaps begin to understand that not all humanity had been lost. The Mississippi sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the barracks, and the camp settled into a tentative peace. For the first time in years, the German women of Camp Co. were not thinking about survival alone. They were beginning to dream again. The days in Camp Co began early. At 6 a.m., a shrill whistle from Corporal Betty Matthews echoed through the compound, stirring the women from restless sleep. Liesel Hartmann rubbed her eyes and adjusted the thin blanket round her shoulders. The previous day's breakfast, a memory of golden yolks, crispy bacon, and steaming coffee, still lingered on her tongue, surreal and almost dreamlike. She had thought such abundance belonged only to stories or fantasies. Yet here, in the Mississippi sun, it was real. Annika Weiss followed her into the washroom, quietly humming an old lullaby from Dresden. The hot water felt alien against her sunburned skin, a gentle contrast to the icy showers of transit camps in France. I never thought I'd feel clean again, she whispered. Liesel nodded. It's strange, isn't it, that we survived this war and now we're just humans again. After morning routines, the women assembled in the mess hall for breakfast. It had become a ritual, almost sacred, the way they approached the serving line. The aroma of fried eggs and crisp bacon carried through the hall, mingling with the scent of freshly brewed coffee. Margaret Keller, a spirited former clerk from Stuttgart, walked slowly, savoring the anticipation. Each bite of food brought a flood of memories. Sunday breakfasts with her mother, her grandmother's gentle scolding when she spilled coffee, the sound of laughter at the family table. Not all women reacted the same way. Older prisoners, like Hilda Braun, ate with careful composure, internalizing their shock. Younger women, like Gretel Fischer, 19, often wept quietly, overwhelmed by the sheer kindness that contradicted everything they had been taught. They had been told the Americans were monsters, decadent and cruel, but the reality of warm meals and clean beds tore at the narratives forced upon them for years. Work assignments followed breakfast, yet these two were tinged with an unfamiliar dignity. Liesel and Annika were assigned to the camp laundry, a massive, industrial operation processing uniforms and linens. The machines hummed efficiently, steam rising like soft clouds from the mangles. It works, Annika observed one morning, her voice filled with wonder. Everything here, it all works. Liesel smiled faintly. Even the machines, even this place is better than I expected. Meanwhile, some women assisted in the kitchen under strict supervision. They were never allowed to prepare meals independently, but the experience brought them a quiet satisfaction. They began to recognize the rhythm of the camp, the predictability of labor, and the comfort of routine. For women who had spent months in chaos and hunger, these small structures were a balm to their frayed nerves. The psychological shift was even more profound than the physical recovery. Cognitive dissonance settled in as the German women struggled to reconcile propaganda with reality. Fred Vogel, a former Nazi propagandist, refused classes in civics and re-education, insisting that generosity was a trick, yet most women quietly absorbed lessons, their worldview slowly expanding beyond the strictures of ideology. They began to recognize a simple, revolutionary truth, that humanity could exist even in wartime. Evenings brought a quieter rhythm. The camp's library, modest but orderly, offered German women the chance to read books they had once cherished or discover new ideas. Liesel found herself drawn to novels about ordinary life in America, small-town routines and bustling farms. Outside, a choir of prisoners practiced German folk songs, interwoven with American hymns, creating a strange harmony of old and new worlds. Small moments became treasures. A jug of sweet iced tea brought to the farm workers' quarters, a letter from a sister or mother in Hamburg, the first apple or orange since the war's outbreak, exotic and almost hallucinatory. Every act of kindness or normalcy challenged the narrative they had grown up with, a quiet but undeniable confrontation with reality. Margaret Keller began to notice subtle changes in herself and her fellow prisoners. Cheeks filled out, dark circles faded, and even the youngest, most fragile women showed signs of physical recovery. But more than weight or strength, it was the emotional resilience that surprised them. Fear slowly gave way to cautious trust. Smiles returned, hesitant at first, then more confident. They were still prisoners, but the world they had been promised in propaganda full of cruelty and starvation had crumbled before their very eyes. On Sundays, the women gathered in the camp chapel for services. Led by a chaplain from Columbus, the sermons were in English, yet their sincerity transcended language. Liesel closed her eyes, letting the soft organ notes fill her mind. For the first time, she felt a small measure of hope. In a place once defined by captivity, kindness began to feel ordinary, almost natural. By mid-June, the routine solidified. Breakfast remained the highlight, a daily reminder that abundance and care existed even for the defeated. Work, education, prayer, and music filled the days. Slowly, the German women in Camp Co began to reclaim fragments of their identities, rebuilding themselves in ways they never thought possible. And yet, underneath it all, there was a lingering tension, the awareness that this peace, this decency, was a fragile gift, one that had been denied to so many for so long. The taste of eggs, bacon, and coffee was no longer just sustenance. It had become a symbol of something far greater, the possibility that even in the aftermath of war, humanity could endure. By September 1945, the days at Camp Co had fallen into a predictable rhythm, but the news of repatriation brought a wave of nervous excitement. Margaret Keller held her tray in the mess hall, feeling the familiar warmth of eggs, bacon, and coffee beneath her fingertips, as if savoring it one last time. Around her, the other women whispered softly, their eyes reflecting the mix of anticipation and anxiety that came with leaving the only haven they had known in months. Liesel Hartmann glanced around the hall, taking in the familiar faces of friends and comrades. Annika Weiss, now looking stronger and healthier, smiled faintly at her. "Will we survive the journey home?" Liesel asked quietly. Annika shook her head. "I don't know, but we'll have each other." The comforting bond they had formed over countless shared meals and workdays in the laundry gave them strength. Repatriation was no simple process. Paperwork, travel orders, and Red Cross oversight meant long days of waiting and uncertainty. Yet, through it all, the American staff remained patient and encouraging. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Henderson personally oversaw the preparations, ensuring that each woman's needs were considered. "You've endured enough," she told Margaret one afternoon. "The trip home will be long, but you'll be safe and you'll travel with dignity." Margaret felt a warmth in her chest, the kind of reassurance that no propaganda or fear could erase. The journey back to Germany began with a train ride across the American South. The women, many seeing verdant fields and bustling towns for the first time, whispered to one another in astonishment. "It's peaceful here," remarked Gretel Fischer, her eyes wide. "Nothing like what we were told." Margaret nodded silently. "We've been taught to fear the world. Now we see it's capable of kindness." From the port, they boarded a ship bound for Europe. The Atlantic crossing was rougher than anyone expected, but they were fed adequately and treated with care. The sight of the open ocean and the endless gray horizon left some women awestruck. "It's terrifying," Annika admitted one evening, clutching a blanket. "But it's also beautiful." Liesel squeezed her hand. "Survival is strange, Even the terrifying can be a gift. Once in Germany, the scene that greeted them was stark. Stuttgart, Margaret's hometown, lay in ruins, bombed-out buildings, streets of rubble, and scattered survivors struggling to rebuild lives. The contrast between the abundance of Camp Co. and the scarcity at home was jarring. Yet even in devastation, hope persisted. Margaret found her mother alive, her father's voice a whisper in the corner of a ruined apartment. The reunion was emotional, a tangle of tears, laughter, and disbelief. Margaret whispered, "We had eggs, bacon, coffee every morning. Real food. And we were treated as people." Her mother stared, a mix of sorrow and relief crossing her face. Other women faced similar scenes. Hilda Braun, grieving for her sons lost on the Eastern Front, found solace in reconnecting with extended family and neighbors. Liesel and Annika reunited with siblings who had survived, their bonds strengthened by months of shared hardship and recovery. These reunions were quiet, affirmations of life continuing, even after the war had destroyed so much. But the physical return was only part of the journey. Emotional recovery took longer, as the women grappled with cognitive dissonance. How could they reconcile the kindness of their captors with the ideology that had defined their youth? Gretel Fischer reflected aloud one evening, "The Americans, they fed us, treated us with dignity, and all we were told, it was a lie." The realization weighed heavily, but it also opened doors to understanding, empathy, and eventual forgiveness, not for the regime, but for the people who had once been enemies yet showed humanity. Life slowly regained its rhythm. Some women pursued work as translators, bridging the gap between American occupiers and local populations. Others returned to family, trades, or sought new paths in a fractured society. Margaret, inspired by her experiences in Camp Co., took a position assisting in rebuilding communications networks, applying skills honed as a clerk and observer in the Luftwaffe Auxiliary. Liesel and Annika dedicated themselves to community rebuilding projects, determined to turn the lessons learned into something tangible. The memory of those breakfasts remained vivid. Eggs, bacon, and coffee were no longer just meals. They were symbols of resilience, humanity, and the possibility of compassion even amidst cruelty. Margaret often recounted to friends, family, and later her children, "We were prisoners, yes, but every morning, we were reminded that dignity and care are never lost." Even in the darkest times, years later, as they reflected on the war, the prisoners realized that survival had depended not only on strength, but also on small acts of kindness that challenged everything they had believed. Lieutenant Colonel Henderson's insistence on humane treatment, the careful preparation of meals, the patience of the young privates serving them, each act became a touchstone for understanding that human decency could endure, even when surrounded by destruction. Finally, the women could walk freely again, taste the familiarity of home, and embrace life in ways previously unimaginable. They carried with them memories of both suffering and compassion, understanding that the true lessons of war were not only of conflict, but of empathy, kindness, and the fragile, enduring nature of humanity. As Margaret took her last look at the ruins of Stuttgart, she whispered to herself, "Eggs, bacon, coffee, paradise exists, even if only in moments." She smiled, knowing that the memory of those mornings, the lessons learned, and the friendships forged would last a lifetime. If this story of resilience, humanity, and unexpected kindness moved you, share it with someone who values the untold stories of World War II. Subscribe and join us for more incredible accounts of human courage, hope, and compassion amidst history's darkest moments.